Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Chai Talk with Wajatli for the Left Hook Substack. I would be drinking chai right now, but I'm fasting because it's Ramadan, so imagine me drinking chai. And this is a series that I do where I invite a subject matter expert who's far smarter than me to break down one big question or questions in 30 minutes or less. And today I have my friend Amy Spitalnik, who is a fellow masochist dealing with all the chaos of the day. Amy has an amazing bio. I'm going to give you some highlights. She is the CEO of JCPA, the Jewish Council of Public Affairs, the national convener of Jewish coalitions working across communities to build a just and inclusive America. In her previous life, she was the executive director of Integrity First for America. You might remember them because they won that groundbreaking lawsuit against the neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and hate groups responsible for the Charlottesville violence. Remember that? The very fine people that Trump called them, I think, yeah. The ones who said the Jews will not replace us. And she has also worked in New York's Attorney General office. And she's joining me today to unpack this question, which is so topical with the breaking news. I swear I didn't plan this, Amy, of the past hour. How is the Trump administration weaponizing anti-Semitism and using Jews to undermine democracy? It's a big one, but for those who are tuning in, we're taping this at 4:30 p.m. Friday, and this is breaking news. Amy, I want to share this with you. The United States Justice Department is examining whether student protests at Columbia University over the genocide violated federal terrorism laws, according to Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche. And now two students involved in the pro-Palestinian protests have faced immigration consequences. Now we have Leka Cordia from West Bank. She was arrested by ICE, and another student, Ranjani Srinivasan from India, had her F1 visa revoked, and she self-deported to Canada. And we haven't even talked about Mahmoud Khalil, who's a green card holder, who is now in Louisiana, detained, threatened to be deported, and the White House itself admits no evidence of any criminal activity, but it doesn't matter. So with all that, Amy, with all that, I come back to the question, and maybe you disagree with me, I don't think you do. How is the Trump administration weaponizing anti-Semitism and using, or perhaps we should say abusing Jews to undermine democracy? I'll give you the opener.
Well, to your point, the timing could not be more perfect. And you and I have spent a lot of time over the last year having the conversations about how we got to this moment. And I think we're actually now in the moment where so much of what you and me and our friends like Eric Ward and so many others have been warning about. To the question, so multiple things are true at the same time here, but it seems like that's lost from so much of the conversation. Of course, anti-Semitism is real. It exists in America, it exists across the political spectrum, it even exists on college campuses. And the very real fears and concerns that the Jewish community has about anti-Semitism, which are legitimate, are now being exploited by the Trump administration to fundamentally go after democratic norms, civil liberties, the rule of law. And that doesn't just make the people targeted by these efforts unsafe, it makes all of us, including Jews, unsafe, because inclusive pluralistic democracy is inherent to all of our safety and has actually been inherent to the safety of Jews and the progress we've been able to make as a community in this country over the last few decades. And so we know that this is true, certainly in terms of the recent activities, whether it is the arrest of Mahmoud Khalil and now seemingly some of these other students, although I guess we're still learning many details there. But to your point, there have been so few details actually put out about what they're actually being held for. Right? Everyone in this country is entitled to basic due process and civil liberties, including those who are here on a green card or on a visa. And when we selectively apply the law based on politics or someone's identity, again, that fundamentally undercuts our democracy and makes all of us unsafe. I can have real fundamental disagreements with Mahmoud Khalil and the other students mentioned, and I'm confident I do. But that doesn't mean that we should be throwing out our fundamental values in saying that due process, civil liberties, and the democratic norms that are so inherent to this country should be totally exploited in service of countering anti-Semitism.
And we'll connect the dots, but this isn't just recent, right? Because you and I have been keeping the receipts, and like you mentioned, Amy, you, me, and Eric Ward, like the halal kosher guinea pigs that we are, we've done like these 8 or 9, I think, talks, panels over the past year and a half since October 7th, trying to raise the alarm, specifically of how white supremacists, neo Nazis, hate mongers, who, let's just be honest, don't care about any of our communities, are using the spill out, the crisis from what's happened in Gaza to basically attack both of our communities. We've seen a spike in anti-Palestinian violence, anti-Arab violence, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, both here and in Europe. The two communities who are the most screwed are our communities. And Trump has been preying on this for about a decade now. I remember, Amy, that the alarm bells went off in Charlottesville. And talk to us about Charlottesville, why that was, if you will, a major warning sign about where this was headed.
Yeah, look, for me, watching the images coming out of Charlottesville that weekend in August of 2017 were both horrifying and confusing, right? When we heard Nazis chant, Jews will not replace us, even those of us who were deeply engaged in politics or countering hate were a little confused. It was this fringe conspiracy theory that was all of a sudden being platformed by these Nazis with torches descending on Charlottesville. And of course, the violence that weekend really, I think, ripped the Band-Aid off for many in terms of what was possible, and the increasing emboldenment of these violent extremists, of course, leading to the death of Heather Heyer, and the broader injuries that weekend. There's so much to say about what actually happened that weekend, and our lawsuit detailed the fact that none of it was accidental; it was planned,
All
deliberately
intentional,
in
all planned.
advance,
Yeah.
in horrific, racist, anti-Semitic, and xenophobic social media chats where they even talked in advance about hitting protesters with cars and then claiming self-defense, which is, of course, precisely what happened. But the conspiracy theories that were at the core of Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us, the great replacement, this idea that Jews are orchestrating an effort to replace the white race, immigrants, refugees, Black and brown people, and others, right? Those have moved from the fringes to the mainstream over the last 7, 8 years. We've seen it fuel a cycle of horrific mass violence targeting Jews in Pittsburgh, the deadliest attack on the Jewish community in U.S. history, at Tree of Life, and in Poway, California, at Chabad, the Latino community in El Paso, the Black community in Buffalo, the Muslim community in Christchurch, New Zealand. This has global implications.
And,
Of
and this was
course,
also, if I may, this was the first Trump administration that this all happened. And
correct.
and you mentioned the replacement theory, and just the timing of this was, when we saw the Tree of Life massacre, I believe it was November 2018, right before the midterm elections. And can you remind everyone what Donald Trump and Republicans, the conspiracy theory they were promoting? It wasn't Haitians eating pets. Can you tell everyone what it was, which happened to be the same talking point of Robert Bowers, the terrorist who went and killed Jews?
It was exactly the great replacement. It was this idea that there was an invasion of people coming into this country to replace the electorate, ultimately to steal the election. And we saw this manifest on January 6th that the Capitol would stop the steal and so much of the other violence and extremism that became normalized. And we're even seeing it now, right? What was, again, fringe in 2017 or 2016 has now been wholly normalized in our politics and in our policy. We actually, if you look at the anti-immigrant executive orders that have come out from this administration, they explicitly use invasion and replacement rhetoric to justify the dehumanizing policies of mass deportations and others that we're now seeing come to action. In fact, the President Trump is now planning to invoke an antiquated law specifically rooted in this idea of the country being invaded to justify mass deportations. And so,
Alien Enemies Act of
exactly.
18th century. This has been used 3 times, folks. 1812, War of 1812, World War One, where it was used against the Italians and Germans, who were seen as the enemies of the day, and also, most shamefully, World War II, where innocent Americans of Japanese descent, without any evidence, were interned, lost their homes, lost their livelihoods. One of those traumatic warts in American history that American presidents have looked back upon with disgust and shame, but not Donald Trump, who just invoked it this week, like you said, to go after any dangerous element, without, of course, as we've seen with Mahmoud Khalil, any proof. It doesn't matter. They just have to be deemed a national security threat. Sorry, I just wanted to give context for those who don't know.
That's exactly right. And I think it goes hand in hand with how we're now seeing these conspiracy theories and broader extremism being used to fundamentally go after the core democratic norms that are inherent to all of our safety. It's not removed from the fact that Elon Musk, who has not incidentally also trafficked in some of these very direct conspiracy theories or given a Nazi salute and emboldened Holocaust deniers and other extremists
No,
were.
seriously, can you? Yeah, people don't realize that Twitter has become a hub of Nazis and white supremacists, and he has reshared pro-Nazi content. I think just 2 days ago, did you see how he reshared that post about like minimizing the genocidal deaths and murders of like the dictatorships and Nazi governments? Everyone's like,
Well, and
maybe.
he spoke at the AfD conference in Germany, where he basically told Germans to get over the Holocaust. And this is not someone who, you know, is a friend of the Jewish people, to put it lightly.
Maybe he's confused, Amy. Maybe it was his autism, but I have people with autism in my family. Shockingly, none of them are Nazis. Just throwing it out there.
That's a very fair point. And we need to understand that none of these things are happening in a vacuum, right?
Hmm.
Whether it is the normalization of these conspiracy theories to fuel this dehumanizing policies, whether it's Elon Musk who engages in this extremism, leading the effort to effectively gut our federal government. And by the way, when they do so in service of, quote, opposing diversity, equity, or inclusion, they're also, of course, using efforts to pit our communities against one another to fundamentally undercut the rule of law and our democracy. And we can go on and on the various ways in which so much of the extremism that, again, felt fringe not that long ago has been normalized in service of not just specific dangerous policies, which in and of itself should be enough to ring the alarm bells, but the broader weaponization of the federal government in service of an anti-democratic agenda. And none of that is good for any of us, including and especially Jews who have always historically been safest in inclusive, pluralistic democracies.
Can you, I want to talk about how historically it's been terrible for Jews for a second because Donald Trump and the White House administration, in their justification for all these actions, these crackdowns, the Justice Department just today, trying to see whether or not it's terrorism for disagree with the speech, that's fine, but terrorism, support for terrorism, talking about all these pro-Palestinian activists as being aligned with Hamas, no proof. To crack down with the Alien Enemies Act. I want to remind people that Donald Trump also quoted Hitler before, yet again quoted Hitler. It's not just once, right before the election, and said he will unleash the National Guard and military against the quote enemies from within. They say, Amy, that they're doing it to combat anti-Semitism. So when you hear that the Trump administration, in order to combat anti-Semitism, is doing everything that we just mentioned for the past 10 minutes, how do you feel?
I mean, it's a total exploitation of the very real concerns and fears that the Jewish community has right now. And again, where we started this conversation, multiple things are true at the same time. There has been a very real uptick in anti-Semitism, not just over the last decade, although that's certainly true, but also specifically since October 7th, to your point. We've seen a huge uptick in anti-Semitism and in Islamophobia and anti-Arab hate. I've seen it myself in my own life. My synagogue was targeted. We do know that there is actually, in fact, anti-Semitism that exists on college campuses. And we have to acknowledge that if we're going to have a legitimate conversation about this. But to weaponize, to exploit those very real concerns, to totally gut democratic norms and the rule of law fundamentally doesn't advance Jewish safety. It undercuts Jewish safety. We can't have Jewish safety in America without inclusive, pluralistic democracy in which the rights and safety of all communities are protected. Because if anyone in the Jewish community thinks this is going to start and stop with a few Palestinian activists on a few college campuses, they're fooling themselves. We know that this ultimately leads to any other community that is seen at odds with the administration fundamentally being targeted in the long run. And so, too, it's important to acknowledge that we can't have inclusive democracy without effectively and constructively confronting anti-Semitism. And so if this administration actually cared about countering anti-Semitism, there are so many things that they can do on college campuses and beyond. First of all, I would start with not gutting and cutting in half the staff of the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Education, which they did this week as well, which
Right.
is the very office intended to protect the civil rights of Jewish students and all students on college campuses. It was an office that was already woefully understaffed under Biden. Caseworkers there had over 50 cases apiece at a time when we know that there were very real attacks on Jewish students, Muslim students, Arab students, Black students, LGBTQ students, and others on college campuses that needed to be investigated sufficiently by DOE. And instead, the Trump administration has come in, gutted the Department of Ed with a particular focus on the Office of Civil Rights, shutting down over half of its offices around the country. There's already a massive backlog of cases. So how this administration can claim it's countering anti-Semitism on campus while eliminating the very staff and tools and offices we have to fight anti-Semitism on campus is sort of a perfect encapsulation of the hypocrisy here. But of course, there's so much more that the administration can and must do if they were genuinely
If
serious about countering anti-Semitism, and they're not doing any of it while rather exploiting our legitimate fears and concerns to advance their broader anti-democratic agenda.
It reminds me of an arsonist who burns down the house and then comes back and says, "Man, you guys need better maintenance. Like, what's happening here?" And so these are folks that, and I've used this example, and I think you agree with me. I've been saying this on social media, trying to connect the dots for folks is that they don't care about Jews. They don't care about anti-Semitism. They don't care about Arabs, clearly, Palestinians, clearly, Muslims. They don't care about their own base. What they care about is power. And what they care about is fulfilling their goal, which is to dismantle the Department of Education, public education, universities, free speech, free assembly. And they realize, aha, we have a great, if you will, vehicle, a test case. This to me is a test case. And what, is that it's that oft used quotation, but it applies, first they came for. And I don't think people are realizing, they're like, Palestinian activists already dehumanized, already seen as like Hamas and extremists, right? Even on television, I was telling someone that Ilhan Omar, Scott Jennings, who just got a raise at CNN, on Abby Phillips' panel a couple of months ago, said that Ilhan Omar was a Hamas PR agent. No pushback. Just this normalization of dehumanization. And so like, go after those pro-Palestinians. And even if you see on social media now the right wing saying, they're not Palestinian activists, they're pro-Hamas. And then what people aren't realizing is this is literally being used in real time against the press, against doctors, against law enforcement, against Republicans. It's going to be used against LGBTQ. It's going to be used against Jews. And I don't think people are realizing it within Jewish communities, certain Jewish communities, that the right wing that they've aligned themselves with, you also have a Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson problem now, right? And now they're openly espousing this type of, I would say, not just criticism of Israel, but criticism of Israel to Trojan horse a criticism of Jews, which brings me to the point, why, oh, why, and I don't know if you're going to get in trouble for this, I don't know, ADL, a civil rights organization, cheerleading what's happening at Columbia University. Explain this to me, Amy, because everyone is just like, everyone who doesn't know, they're like, wait, isn't ADL a civil rights organization? And I could tell you on the DL, Jewish leaders have told me, even those who are pro-Israel, Zionist, but liberal, they've used the word ADL is a shanda right now. I don't want to get you in trouble. I know you're the head of JCPA, but talk to us about the Jewish support for what's happening right now.
Well, I will say actually the vast majority of American Jews across the ideological spectrum have I think been clear, at least in all of my conversations this week. And I was out in Michigan this week. I've had many conversations with many Jews across the ideological spectrum. They are horrified by what's happening this week, and they are trying to hold the complexity of this moment, right? Again, all of us know to be true that there is real anti-Semitism on campus. I was just out, for example, in Michigan, where my friend, University of Michigan Regent Jordan Acker, He has had his home targeted under the guise of protesting Israel on campus and had mason jars filled with urine thrown through through his front window as his kids slept, right? There are very real instances in which the conversation on Israel has crossed into overt anti-Semitism and harm as it relates to college campuses. And we have to acknowledge that. And Jews can hold that and at the same time be fundamentally opposed to the administration exploiting us to advance this agenda. And that is what I've heard consistently across the board from the vast majority of American Jews that I speak to. And if you look at what the polls say, right, Jews are voting on issues of democracy. Democracy is the top issue that Jews that they voted on this year because we know in our kishkas, in our guts, that democracy is inherent to our safety. And so I think oftentimes this conversation is framed in a binary that you're either opposed to anti-Semitism or you are opposed to what the Trump administration is doing. The vast majority of Jewish Americans can actually be opposed to both. We can hold, because we know that Jewish safety and democracy aren't opposing issues, they're actually one and the same, and they need to exist hand in hand. And so, to the point of the ADL, look, we work with the ADL on a variety of fronts. They do crucial research on a variety of issues. There's some great experts there who we work very closely with, and we fundamentally disagree with them on this question. In the conversations I'm having with Jews around the country, rabbis, Jewish communal leaders, folks who come not simply from the progressive or liberal side of the Jewish community, but very much from the center and the center right, are feeling fundamentally concerned by what we're seeing here, and that doesn't take away from the very real fears and concerns we also have about anti-Semitism right now.
The the way this is going to play out, and I think it's just you need better leadership, is because I'm sure you saw the Gallup poll that came out last week that said like a majority of Americans for the first time, right, have like a negative view on Israel, and especially with the Netanyahu government, and especially with what's happening in Gaza. Amnesty calls it a genocide. 45,000 people have been killed. Lancet said it could be up to 75,000. There's like an entire generation has been radicalized in the past year and a half by what they've seen. And what they're saying is, look, we're not against Jews, but it seems that if you criticize Israel, then certain groups like ADL and others accuse you of anti-Semitism. And then we're just stuck, right? And then we're going to speak out against genocide. We're going to speak out against occupation. But then AIPAC comes after you, right? Summer Lee, Representative Summer Lee, we're interviewing here. She openly said, like, the AIPAC is one of the major groups that like goes and attacks Democrats who want an end to the occupation. And she also called it anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, right? So these groups, who I think some of their donors and their base believes we have to do this to support Israel. We have to do this to support Jews, right? Like, if we don't do this, it's like Godfather. If you ever watched first Godfather, there's like Luca Brasi. Yes, he's an unsavory character, but we have to unleash Luca Brasi to save our people. What do you say to those Jews in your community? Because to me, as an outside, I see this, Amy, and I'm like, obviously this is terrible for Palestinians. Clearly, like, they're completely screwed. Muslims, Arabs. Also, a lot of the pro-Palestinian activists, I want to be clear here, it's a multiracial, multicultural group. There's Jews who are going to be affected. There were a lot of Jewish leaders saying not in our name. But I see what's about to happen and what's happening, and my analogy of Jews being used as a battering ram, this to me is not good for Jews. Like, it just seems like it will put Jews in a vice in America and make them more and more stuck, more and more isolated, and then you're going to be attacked from the right. And now you're going to be attacked from a whole bunch of people who say, aha, see, it's only because I'm criticizing Israel and Jewish money and Jewish power is being used to go after democracy. I mean, maybe this is my concern, but I'm sure you agree with me. Like, this is terrible for Jews in the long run, maybe even in the short run.
Look, I mean, so much of this is rooted in the fact that the conversation is had in false binaries, right? These false binaries of the Israel conversation, which have dominated it for so long before October 7th, are now really coming home to roost. And so I want to say a few things. I think one, multiple things, again, true at the same time. For example, with AIPAC, I don't agree with everything AIPAC does, certainly. Also, I think some of the language that has come to the fore around AIPAC, right, has intentional or not played into conspiratorial tropes around Jews and power and money. And so we need to be able to talk about AIPAC in a way in which there's fundamental disagreements over policy that also doesn't play into those tropes. And that's a conversation that I think the left needs to be able to have if they're going to effectively navigate this issue. At the same time, when we talk about what happened on October 7th and the aftermath in Gaza, the conversation is had in such binaries. You're either supportive of the Palestinian people and horrified by what's happening in Gaza, or you are horrified by the terror attack of October 7th and the murder of Israelis and the taking of hostages, and you can have no sympathy for the Palestinian people. And the truth is, the vast majority of people can again hold this complexity. What happened on October 7th, it was the deadliest day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust. It was visceral and gutting for so many of us. I was in Israel a few weeks ago when the Bibas children's bodies were returned. And like any human being should be able to look at that and be horrified by it and also not take away from very real horror over what's happening in Gaza and the unacceptable loss of Palestinian life. And this is true in both directions. Those who care about Israel and the Israeli people and the hostages need to be able to recognize Palestinian humanity in this moment. And those who care about the Palestinian people need to be able to recognize the humanity of Israelis, including the hostages that remain. And we're able to actually do all of these things at the same time, but the loudest voices are telling us that it's impossible and that you can have to pick a side here. And that's just simply not true. And the way that that's playing out here in America is that it's leading to this increasingly narrow space in which anyone who's able to hold complexity, which I would actually say is the vast majority of us, is being pushed from all directions. And that's exactly what extremists want. It's exactly what's benefiting the Trump administration right now, where the very coalitions we need to be protecting democracy, to be countering hate at a moment of rising extremism and authoritarianism are being fractured by these fights over Israel and Gaza. And we need to figure out a way to say, hey, we're going to have disagreements over this. You and I certainly have policy disagreements over Israel and Gaza. Me and folks like, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who I did a webinar with last summer on anti-Semitism, right? We have disagreements over this. And we need to be able to sit down and say there are some basic human values that we can actually agree on here. Because if our coalitions fall apart, it's going to be the most extreme voices, including and especially the president, who take advantage of that and use it to advance this anti-democratic agenda at a time when we are already so vulnerable.
Yeah, so what we saw is, though, there is some pushback. I don't know if you saw in the Trump Towers, they said there were 100 members of JVP. I know JVP is not a mainstream organization, but nonetheless, they've been active within the Jewish organizations, I should say, Jewish communities. Whenever I say JVP, a lot of Jewish leaders are like, they're fringe. But hey, they showed up, and they, like, I think 100 of them in the shirts, not in our name, I believe. They took over Trump Towers protesting what's been happening to Mahmoud Khalil. What do you think is a step forward? Because Israel-Palestine has always been the elephant in the room. It seems like it's at a loggerheads right now with what's happened in the past year and a half. We have this administration that claims to fight anti-Semitism by trafficking in anti-Semitism, that is now going after undocumented immigrants, that is now going after green card holders, that has gone after LGBTQ. You see Jewish leaders unwilling to talk to Arab leaders unwilling to talk to Jewish leaders. And meanwhile, I believe, Amy, our democracy is under full-scale assault and attack by what I believe is an authoritarian regime, or a wannabe authoritarian regime. As a person who has spent the last several years trying to navigate these complexities, oftentimes on the winning end and on the losing end as well, you've been boycotted. You mentioned your conversation with AOC. A lot of people appreciated it. Some people didn't, even though I thought it was a good conversation. What is a way forward in this particular time with all the sensitivities?
Well, I'll say a few things. I think, right, you brought up JVP, and I think many in the Jewish community, to your point, feel like they are not representative of the Jewish community. And so there's sort of this effort oftentimes in this conversation where sort of unrepresentative voices get tokenized in both directions, right? Certain more conservative Jewish groups lift up tokenized and unrepresented voices in the Muslim or Arab American community, and the same thing happens in the Jewish community, where I think sometimes JVP or others get pointed to as representative of more than they might be. In this case, what we're talking about here with Mahmoud Khalil and the current situation, the vast majority of Jewish Americans, I think, are still fundamentally opposed to what the Trump administration is doing. Not because they agree with Mahmoud Khalil, not because he should be held up as some hero, but because he, like anyone else in this country, is entitled to basic due process rights and civil liberties. And when they are violated, that threatens all of us. And so I think we need to be able to actually figure out a way for the mainstreams of our communities to talk to each other in a way that recognizes, again, where each of us are right now. There are very real pains and fears and disagreements, and that's okay. That's disagreement is actually a good thing in a healthy democracy. But how we can actually figure out a way to have these conversations rooted in humanity, in not losing sight of the dignity of people both in Israel and Gaza and here in the United States, and how we can also really begin to speak the same language. Because I think in so many cases, having these conversations, whether it be with Arab American, Muslim American, other partners in this work, we're acknowledging that we're not even speaking the same language to begin with, right? The term Zionist means one thing to me, and it means something entirely different to someone who might be using it in a college protest. The term Intifada is heard by me in one specific way, and it's perhaps intended differently by someone who's using it. And so how we even begin to bring the conversation down from the sort of extreme shouting that has dominated it over the last year and a half by the loudest voices to actually constructive conversations like this one, where we're able to actually talk about what's at stake, bring it to a place of humanity and fundamental rights, as opposed to the false binaries that have so often dominated this, is something that all of us can do, whether you're on a college campus, whether you're in an interfaith community, whether you're talking with your neighbors or in your schools. And so you don't need to be the leader of an organization to actually be advancing a more human approach to how we address these issues at a time when, again, the loudest voices are trying so hard to divide us. And so for me, that's step one. And that's something that we are trying to do all the time with our partners in coalition work at JCPA. Again, not because we agree on everything, but because the only path forward is one in which we're able to actually have hard, challenging conversations that take on the elephants in the room in a way that doesn't lose sight of humanity and basic human rights.
I don't envy you and your position, Amy, but I'm glad you're the one doing it and being the kosher guinea pig to try our best to bridge some divides, as there is an authoritarian regime that does not care about Jews, Muslims, Arabs, Palestinians, any minority groups, does not care about freedom, does not care about the free press, but is using our communities in a divide and conquer for the sake of power. I hope there are more leaders like you. Amy Spitalik is the CEO of JCPA, Jewish Council for Public Affairs. Please follow her, support her. Thank you all for watching another episode of Chai Talk with Wajat Ali. As always, take care of yourselves, be kind, and please, oh please, don't be a fascist. Take care.